Around 6 p.m. on December 10th, 2003, 45-year-old Susie Wamsley unpacked Christmas decorations at her home in the city of Mansfield, Texas, alternating between removing items from boxes and explaining what they were to her 3-year-old granddaughter. Christmas had always been a big deal to Susie, and so every year she went all out. Her 46-year-old husband, Rick, had hung the lights outside last night, and now it was time for her to tackle the interior. And it was extra important to get it done early this year because their neighbors were coming over for a holiday party in just a few days. The thought gave Susie a little twinge of anxiety, and so she twirled her red hair around her finger as she watched her granddaughter inspect an ornament. Just then, Susie heard a camera shutter, and she looked up to see Rick taking a picture of the moment. He winked and told her it was a good one, before plopping down on the couch and showing their granddaughter another ornament from the box. Susie smiled. She was so happy that Rick got to have these moments with their granddaughter. When their own kids had been young, Rick had worked a lot at his accounting job. This had allowed the family to live in a big house in an exclusive neighborhood, but it had also meant that Rick missed out on a lot. He'd spent long hours at the office while Susie stayed home with their kids, Sarah and Andrew. And so it was Susie who had gotten to go to all of Sarah's cheerleading pep rallies and take Andrew on fishing trips. But now that Rick worked from home and so had more time, it was his turn now with their granddaughter. Just then, Susie heard the door open and a voice call out. Seconds later, Sarah walked into the room. Sarah first gave her little girl a big hug, then she stood and greeted Susie and Rick. But right away, Susie noticed that Sarah looked worried. Susie asked her what was up, and Sarah sort of looked down and said sort of sheepishly that she'd gotten another bill. Susie knew that the bill Sarah must be referring to was a legal bill, and it wouldn't be the last. Sarah was right in the middle of a custody battle with her ex-husband, Todd, and Susie and Rick were funding it. Which Susie was more than willing to do, because she knew Sarah was a great mom and they wanted to continue seeing their granddaughter as much as they could. But this whole mess was not the first time Sarah's problems had put a lot of stress on the family. Sarah used to be sort of a typical kid, she was an outgoing, bubbly cheerleader with lots of friends and just did typical teenage girl things. But then by the end of her teen years, she really began leaning into partying and also dating older men. At one point, towards the end of high school, Susie and Rick had even kicked her out of the house. But unfortunately, that had backfired because Sarah had moved in with her ex-husband, Todd, and gotten pregnant. And their relationship resulted in lots of mental health struggles for Sarah and also some substance abuse. But the whole family had still gotten through it, and now Sarah was 25 years old and doing much better. And they had their beautiful granddaughter. So Susie just swallowed down her own complicated feelings about Sarah's newest legal bill and just smiled at her daughter. She told her not to worry about it, she and her father would pay for it. Sarah was visibly relieved and thanked her mother and father. And then not long after that, the family decided to head out for dinner. And at that point, Susie dashed upstairs to let her other child, her 19-year-old son Andrew, know that they were leaving. Andrew still lived at home because he had been going to a community college nearby. However, when Susie got up to his room, she found it was empty. And Susie just shook her head, trying her best to suppress her bitter disappointment. But ultimately, she really wasn't surprised by his absence, because Andrew lately had been spending more and more time out of the house. Andrew had always been a pretty quiet kid, but lately he'd been getting so frustrated and mad so easily and basically fought with everybody in the family constantly. And then, just this past fall, Susie had found out that her son had secretly dropped out of community college, even though she and her husband had just bought him a car for having kept up his grades. And ever since, the mood in the house had been tense, to say the least. So Andrew, probably to get away from that tense feeling, had been spending more and more time out of the house with his girlfriend Chelsea. And so Susie figured that must be where he was now, out with Chelsea, which was sort of a bummer to Susie, because he'd slipped out without saying anything to anyone, even though they had all talked about how after dinner that night, the family was going to decorate the Christmas tree, which was a family tradition, and it looked like he wouldn't be there. But there was nothing she could do, so Susie sighed, left the room, and headed downstairs. Hours later, the family was back at home after having dinner and after decorating the Christmas tree, and Rick and Susie were playing a board game with Sarah and their granddaughter. And they were having a nice time until Sarah finally stood up and announced that she was tired and needed to get her daughter off to bed. And just a few minutes after that, they had left the house, and suddenly the house felt really quiet. Susie looked around the room, which was now a Christmas wonderland after all the decorating they had done. They'd covered the stair banister and the fireplace mantel with wreaths, and the tree was all lit up and bright. There were even presents already under the tree, wrapped and ready for their kids and granddaughter. Susie took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of brownies that she had taken out of the oven just a little bit ago. They were Andrew's favorite, but Andrew was not here. Susie asked Rick if he wanted a brownie, but he didn't answer. And when she looked up, she saw that Rick was starting to doze off on the couch. So she suggested that they both just go upstairs and go to bed. But hours later, Susie lay in bed, completely awake. She still had a million things on her mind, like other presents she still had to buy and the errand she had to run for the party with the neighbors that was coming up later that week. She tossed and turned a bit longer, but when she just could not sleep, she finally just got up and went downstairs, turned on the TV, and laid down on the couch. And sure enough, not long after laying down and suddenly being surrounded by the sparkle of Christmas lights, Susie felt tired and finally drifted off to sleep. Around 24 hours later, at 11:40 p.m. on December 11th, a 911 operator sat at their post in the Mansfield police station. They were nearing the end of their shift, so they were tired and bleary-eyed. But they snapped back into focus when a call came in. They picked it up and clearly announced themselves, but there was no answer from the caller. However, this wasn't really unusual to the operator. Calls like this are referred to as silent calls and are often an accident or a prank. But a caller who doesn't say anything could also be in danger and may be unable to speak. So the operator followed protocol and looked up the phone number the call was being made from and was able to get an address, 820 Turnberry Drive, Mansfield, Texas. And as soon as the operator had that location, they sent a message to the officers on duty requesting that somebody go to the scene and just make sure everything was okay. Just 4 minutes later, 3 officers pulled up to 820 Turnberry Drive. And they didn't need to do much investigating to see that they were clearly in a wealthy part of town. This was an exclusive neighborhood called Walnut Estates, and the street was lined with all these big, beautiful houses. And number 820 was no exception. It was a sprawling 2-story brick home that was clearly getting a jump on Christmas because it was already covered in holiday lights. However, those lights were currently off, and the house was dark. It was close to midnight, so the officers guessed the homeowners must have accidentally dialed the emergency line and not known it, and then gone to sleep, not realizing what they had done. Regardless, the officers got out of their cruiser and went to the front door to knock and ring the doorbell. And when nobody answered, they went around the side of the house and began to look in the windows, but they couldn't see much, and they also couldn't hear any movement coming from inside. And this did put them a bit on edge, because somebody had to have been home in order to call 911 a few minutes ago, and whoever it was, even if it was by mistake, now wasn't answering. So the officers decided they did need to get inside this house, because now they were thinking, it was possible that somebody could be injured and maybe unable to respond. When they tried the front door, they found it was locked, so they walked around to look for a way in, and they saw the attached garage door was open. So they opened it up, stepped inside, and called out. Nobody answered, so they kept walking into the house. And as they kept walking into the house, they began to hear this low-pitched electronic droning sound. The officers shined their flashlights through the dark and followed the sound into the kitchen. And there, on the counter, was the source of that droning sound. It was the receiver of a landline phone that had been left off its hook. At this point, the officers drew their weapons. They didn't know what was going on, but it felt suspicious enough that they should be on guard. As they made their way out of the kitchen, they moved quickly and quietly, because they really weren't sure what was waiting for them in the rest of the house. But even with their guards up, they were not ready for the scene they stumbled onto in the living room. At first glance, even in the dark, it was clear this room was destroyed. And then as their eyes began to adjust, they saw the room was also covered with blood. There were huge pools of it soaked through the carpet in front of the fireplace, and lamps and furniture had been overturned and spattered with more blood. And then one of the police officer's flashlight beams landed on the couch. And there, under a blanket that was also soaked with blood, was the body of a woman. For a second, none of the officers said anything. Then, another officer shined his flashlight around the room in a slow circle until the light fell on the body of a man, lying face down only a few feet away. 2 victims, both almost certainly dead. The officers called for backup. Not long after that backup call went out, The detective on call for the Mansfield Police Department, Ralph Standifer, stood in the front yard of 820 Turnberry Drive, staring up at the home. All the lights were on inside, and uniformed officers had pulled crime scene tape around the perimeter. Outside, flashing police and ambulance lights lit up the street as crime scene techs geared up to begin their job. Standifer rubbed his eyes. He'd been with the department for almost 20 years, but it was still hard to get used to being woken up from a deep sleep by his pager. He was there with another detective, Mark Kelly. They'd already been briefed on the situation. The home was owned by a couple in their 40s named Rick and Susie Wamsley, and they both appeared to have been shot to death. Now, Standifer hadn't even stepped foot in the house yet, but he already knew there was a lot about this case that didn't make sense. Officers had gone to the scene because of a 911 call that came in less than an hour ago, but it didn't seem like Rick or Susie had made that call. Judging by the state of their bodies, they'd been dead for a lot longer than that. Standifer assumed, this meant that the killer must have made the 911 call, either because they lingered in the home after killing them and then made the call, or they left the scene and then returned at some point to make that 911 call. Standifer knew that, it was possible that somebody else, who was not the killer, could have anonymously made the call after discovering the bodies, but that felt far-fetched. Like, why would that person not stay and at least give more information to police? And so Standifer was hoping that once he got inside and looked around, things would make more sense. Standifer and Kelly walked up to the home and pulled plastic booties over their shoes before entering. Once inside, they split up. Kelly went through each room taking video, while Standifer just did a walkthrough of the entire crime scene. Standifer first stopped to examine the front door, and he didn't see anything that indicated it had been forced open. And as he walked through the home, he didn't notice any other doors or windows that showed evidence of forced entry either. However, that was where the killer's smoothness ended. The whole scene was an incredible mess. There was a ton of bloody shoe prints all over the place. There were some bloody fingerprints on the wallpaper in the dining room. There was a knife blade that was missing its handle on the carpet. And then, of course, there was the living room, where it looked like an intense, bloody, horrible fight had taken place. In addition to the overturned furniture, there was also a lot of blood splatter and splotches that indicated whoever was bleeding had fallen multiple times. But despite the mess, there wasn't anything obviously missing. The TV was still there were still wrapped presents under the tree, and there weren't any open drawers or closets, which he would have expected if somebody was here looking for something to steal. So Standifer did not think this was a robbery gone wrong. He turned to look at the couch where the woman still lay under the blanket. This was Susie Wamsley. She'd been shot in the head, but her blanket had been pulled up and her expression was almost peaceful, which suggested she might have died while she was still asleep. But this didn't track with the rest of her wounds, because whoever had shot her had apparently also stabbed her repeatedly in the neck and torso. It was clear she hadn't struggled though, which suggested she likely was the first one shot. But that meant the killer stabbed her after she was already dead. It was unusual for a killer to use multiple weapons like that, but it also lined up with the rest of the very chaotic crime scene. Whoever did this was clearly frenzied and highly emotional. Standifer frowned and moved away from Susie towards his other victim, her husband, Rick Wamsley. Rick's body was shirtless, so right away, Standifer saw that he too had been attacked with multiple weapons. He was covered in slashing wounds, and he'd been shot at least once in the head. But unlike Susie, it was clear to Standifer that Rick had fought with his killer. Rick's fist was clenched tightly, and Standifer saw there were actually a few pieces of hair wrapped around Rick's fingers. And so Standifer put on some gloves, and then he knelt down and he opened up Rick's hand to find strands of dark, long hair inside of his palm. And next to Rick's hand on the carpet was a broken blue hair clip. Standifer knew this could be something major, because at least at first glance, it appeared like in Rick's final moments of life, he had managed to grab the hair of his killer and rip some of it out. And this was incredibly lucky, because it meant they would now have an actual piece of forensic evidence, this hair, to test against any suspects that they had. But the evidence was also kind of confusing, because the long hair and the feminine-looking clip suggested that Rick had been fighting with a woman. But physically, that just didn't make much sense. Rick was a big guy. He was at least 6 feet tall and at least 200 pounds, and so Standifer had a hard time imagining a typical woman alone being able to overpower him. Even a strong man might have had trouble dealing with Rick, given Rick's size. So now, as Standifer stood there looking at the hair and the blue clip, he started to wonder if, maybe there wasn't just one killer here. maybe there were multiple killers, and that's how Rick had been overpowered. Stanifer went to go find Detective Kelly. Whether it was one killer or multiple, it was clear the level of brutality at this crime scene suggested there had to have been a personal motive. And so the detectives needed to start making a list of everyone the Wamsleys were close to. It was almost 8 a.m. the following morning by the time Stanifer was done at the scene. When he left the house, he saw that beyond the yellow crime scene tape, there was a crowd of neighbors and news trucks gathered to see what was going on at the Wamsleys. As Stanifer walked to his patrol car, a deputy approached him and told him they'd been talking to some of these neighbors and they had some information. One person said they heard multiple gunshots around 3 a.m. yesterday morning, which was 21 hours before the 911 call came in. And another said that last night around 9 p.m., they noticed the Wamsleys had not turned on their Christmas lights, which was unusual for them. Stanifer ran through this timeline in his head. If it was true that there were gunshots at 3 a.m. on December 11th, and then by 9 p.m. later that same day, the house was uncharacteristically dark and the Christmas lights were not on, well, the reason for that could be because by that time, the Wamsleys were already dead. The 911 call had come about 2.5 hours after that neighbor had noticed the Christmas lights were not on in the house. But somebody was in that house who made the 911 call, and based on this timeline, it seemed it could not have been Rick or Susie because they were dead by the time the 911 call happened. So who was in the house making that call? Stanifer asked the deputies if there was anything else, and they said, yeah, there was. The neighbors had also told them that the Wamsleys had 2 adult children, Sarah and Andrew. Sarah lived in her own apartment, and the deputies had already contacted her. She was on her way to the station. But Andrew still lived with his parents, and the deputies, so far, had not been able to reach him. At this, Stanifer felt himself immediately tense up. Both the Wamsleys' children needed to be looked at as suspects. It was highly likely that with the parents both dead, the kids would inherit money, and probably a lot of it, judging from the very upscale neighborhood where their parents lived. And the fact that Andrew lived with his parents, but wasn't at home and was currently unreachable, made him the much more suspicious of the 2 siblings. But just then, Stanifer heard somebody yelling. He looked up to see a dark-haired young man getting out of the driver's side of a Ford Mustang. He was gesturing wildly to a police officer who had stopped the car, pointing to the home, the crime scene, and saying that that was his house. A young woman got out of the passenger side of the vehicle, and Stanifer could see she and this young man both looked totally panicked. The detective hustled over to the car and asked the young man what his name was, although he was already pretty sure he knew. It was, in fact, Andrew Wamsley. Andrew told them that he and his girlfriend, the woman he was with, had seen a news report about 2 bodies in this neighborhood being found, and he had driven here to make sure it was not his mother and father. As he said this, Stanifer's eyes immediately went to the girlfriend's hair, hoping it was dark brown, like the hair he had found inside of Rick's fist. But it was blonde. Stanifer was momentarily disappointed, but he knew that the girlfriend's hair color didn't actually prove or disprove anything about Andrew himself. And so Stanifer looked around at the news cameras and the crowd and decided he would wait to give Andrew any details about what had happened. And so he just told the young couple to come with him back to the station where he would explain everything. A short time later, Stanifer sat across the table from Andrew inside of an interview room, watching the young man fall apart as he learned his parents were both dead. Andrew looked down at the ground as Stanifer broke the news, unable to speak as tears streamed down his cheeks. Stanifer waited for Andrew to calm down a little bit, but he didn't really calm down at all, and so Stanifer just began asking basic questions because it seemed like Andrew was not going to be capable of giving anything more than short, simple answers. He said that he lived with his parents, but stayed at his girlfriend, Chelsea's, most of the time. And during the period of time that police believed the couple was murdered, Andrew said that he and Chelsea played some miniature golf, they went to the movies, and then they went to a friend's house for most of the night before heading back to Chelsea's to sleep. After that, Andrew went quiet again, staring hard at the floor as his eyes welled up with more tears. To Stanifer, Andrew's emotional reaction to this news seemed pretty sincere. And when Stanifer looked over Andrew's hands and forearms, looking for any of the telltale cuts or bruises the killer almost certainly would have picked up while fighting with Rick, he only saw one small, shallow scratch on his hand, which realistically, Andrew could have gotten anywhere. But his emotional reaction and the lack of cuts and bruises on his body was not enough to rule Andrew out, especially if he was potentially working with somebody else. And so Standifer decided to push him a little bit, just to see how he reacted. He told Andrew that he was going to send some officers to check his car for blood, and he was also going to get Andrew's fingerprints. Then he also said he was going to have to confirm his alibi with his girlfriend and friends, and he was going to check his bank records, looking specifically for large payments that could suggest a paid hit. After that, Standifer just stood there, waiting for Andrew to get defensive or angry. But Andrew just nodded and said that all sounded fine. And so when Standifer stepped out of the interview room, he was not feeling too optimistic about Andrew as a suspect. And so when his partner, Detective Kelly, came around the corner and said Andrew's sister, Sarah, was in an interview room ready to be spoken to, Standifer was glad to hear it. The first thing Standifer noticed when he went into Sarah's interrogation room was that Sarah had long, dark hair, which was roughly the same color as the strands he had seen in Rick's hand. Now, he didn't let his excitement show. Instead, he just sat down at the table and simply asked Sarah what she had been doing on December 10th. Like her brother, Sarah was visibly devastated. But unlike Andrew, who had been barely able to talk, Sarah seemed almost like she was impatient with Standifer's questions. She rattled off her actions on the night of her parents' murder so quickly that Standifer could barely keep up with her. She said that she had gone to her parents' house around 6 p.m. and they had all gone out to dinner. They had all briefly come back to the parents' house after, and then Sarah took her daughter and went home for the night. And Sarah seemed like she might just keep on rambling, but Standifer stopped her and just said, "Look, do you know of anyone who might have wanted to hurt your parents?" And at this, Sarah's eyes widened and she nodded furiously, like she had been waiting for this question. She leaned forward and blurted out that this was exactly what she wanted to tell him. Because 1 month ago, according to Sarah, somebody had tried to kill her and her parents. She said it happened in November. They had been driving on the highway when out of nowhere, they heard this loud banging sound. Worried it could be something to do with the car, they pulled over into a parking lot to see what had happened. That's when they found a distinct bullet hole in the rear of their car, near their gas tank. Sarah said they had reported this to police, but despite looking into it, the police never found a suspect. However, Sarah told Standifer that she always suspected her ex-husband, Todd Cleveland, was the shooter. She told the detective that she and Todd were in a custody battle over their daughter, which her parents were paying for. Todd was furious about it. Standifer sat back in his seat, trying to keep his face neutral, but he felt like a bomb had just been dropped in the middle of his case. The Wamsleys had been shot at twice over a 30-day period. Whoever had killed them was brazen and determined. The detective leaned back and folded his arms as he tried to work out what all this meant to him. On one hand, Sarah had been in the car during that first shooting, which made it very unlikely, but not impossible, that she was involved in that attempt. But she also had no real alibi for the night of her parents' murder, and had admitted she was in desperate need of money. She was also eager to talk, maybe too eager, and she had pointed the finger right at her ex, which could mean she was trying to distract Standifer from looking at her. Or it could mean she was scared, and that Todd Cleveland was the shooter and he was guilty. Luckily though, Standifer didn't have to make any decisions about her guilt or innocence on her demeanor alone. He had those strands of hair from the crime scene. So he told Sarah they would need a DNA sample from her. And Standifer had half expected her to protest, but instead, she agreed immediately. As Standifer left to get one of the evidence techs, he felt more confused than ever. Sarah had seemed like a promising suspect, but her willingness to provide DNA told Standifer she likely did not have much to hide. Standifer suddenly felt the weight of how tired he was. He'd been awake all night, and his exhaustion was making it hard to unravel this case that seemed to get murkier with every clue. The next day was December 13th. It had been 2 days since Rick and Susie Wamsley's bodies had been found, and detectives Ralph Standifer and Mark Kelly were standing around a desk at the Mansfield, Texas Police Precinct. They were going over photos, financial documents, witness statements, and the newly released autopsy results, which just confirmed a lot of what they already knew, that both Rick and Susie had been shot and stabbed, and that Rick had fought back very hard. Standifer was more sure than ever that this was a personal crime, So he and Kelly were going over all of the evidence they had on their two key suspects, the children, Sarah and Andrew Wamsley. In the last couple of days, they had learned a lot more about the Wamsleys and their children. Standifer had been right. The parents had a big estate that their kids were set to inherit. It was worth over $1.5 million. And Rick also had a large life insurance policy as well. And so this gave the siblings a very strong financial motivation for killing their parents. But all Standifer could come up with to this point was evidence that actually ruled both the kids out. They had taken Sarah Wamsley's DNA when they interviewed her, and it was not a match for the hair found at the scene, which didn't mean she wasn't somehow involved, but it meant the only real evidence Standifer had against her was her financial motive and a lack of an alibi. As for Andrew, his alibi checked out. His girlfriend, Chelsea Richardson, confirmed his story. The detectives had also contacted one of his friends, a guy named Jeremy Lavender, and he confirmed that Andrew and Chelsea were with him the night Andrew's parents were killed. Plus, Andrew's fingerprints didn't match the bloody ones that were found at the crime scene. There had also been a preliminary search of Andrew's car, and they hadn't seen any obvious blood yet, although the evidence texts were not quite finished. So, Standifer and Kelly were at the point in this case where they needed to seriously consider other suspects. And luckily, they already had somebody at the top of their list. Sarah had been sure that her ex-husband Todd was responsible for the attack on the Wamsleys that happened a month ago. Standifer had already reached out to the police of the town where the Wamsleys were shot at, and luckily, the officers there had extracted the bullet from their car door. And after testing that bullet, it showed that bullet came from the same gun that was later used to kill the Wamsleys. So, if Todd was a suspect for that attack, well, then by almost default, he had to be a suspect for the murders. So, Standifer grabbed his keys off his desk and flagged Kelly to come with him. It was time to go see Todd Cleveland. When the detectives sat down with Todd at his home, he seemed extremely agitated and sort of rattled. He said he had just heard about the murders, and he was totally stunned. He also said he knew this looked bad for him, but he was adamant he was not involved. He may have been at war with Sarah and Susie, but he liked Rick, and besides, he wasn't around the night of the 10th because he was working. He was a plumber, and he said he had a few emergency jobs that night and in the early morning too. Standifer and Kelly stayed for a bit longer, but they didn't get much more out of Todd. So eventually they left and headed back to the station, and right away they called Todd's plumbing clients to confirm his alibi. And sure enough, it all checked out. Once again, the detectives were back to square one. The following day, Standifer and Kelly drove out to the home of Andrew's girlfriend, Chelsea. They weren't there because they thought Chelsea was a suspect. Her blonde hair had pretty much ruled her out. But the detectives had decided that since they were already starting over, they may as well begin by reevaluating their first two suspects, the Wamsley's children, Andrew and Sarah. Neither sibling appeared to have been at the crime scene, but Standifer and Kelly wanted to learn more about who they were close to, specifically who in their lives they might have trusted enough to help them plan or even carry out a murder. When the detectives arrived at Chelsea's mother's house, where Chelsea lived, they knocked on the door, and Chelsea opened it up. And quickly, she invited the detectives inside. And as soon as they stepped in, Standifer just froze, because the house was truly a mess. Not just in disarray, but disgusting. There was trash everywhere and grime on everything. I mean, it really looked deeply dirty and uncared for. The two detectives just looked at each other and raised their eyebrows. Over on the couch was another young woman who looked to be about Chelsea's age. When she saw the detectives, she stood up, walked over, and introduced herself as Chelsea's friend, Susanna. And over the course of their brief conversation, she told them that she had actually been staying in this house with Chelsea for quite a while. After that, Standifer asked Susanna to please give them some privacy, and she nodded and disappeared into a bedroom. At this point, Standifer sat down with Chelsea and began asking her a couple questions about the days around the murders, while his partner, Kelly, began to pace around the house. Chelsea had already confirmed Andrew's alibi once, but she seemed perfectly willing to go through it again, and nothing about her story changed. And Standifer was just wrapping things up when he heard Kelly gasp in the next room. When Kelly reappeared in the living room, he looked visibly shaken, but he said he was fine. The detectives left shortly after that, and when they got back in the car, Kelly explained why he had reacted like that in the other room. He said he had been looking through all the kitchen drawers because there had been a knife blade at the murder scene and he wanted to see if its matching handle that was missing was in Chelsea's kitchen. But at some point when he opened up a drawer, a whole bunch of roaches crawled out. That's why he gasped. Standifer grimaced. But also, the thought of those roaches made something else click into place that had been bothering him the whole time they were at Chelsea's. He was thinking it seemed very likely somebody living in a place like that, living truly in squalor, might be eager for some money. And so as they drove back to the station, Standifer decided he needed to widen the range of people he was asking for DNA from. It clearly was not enough to get DNA just from Andrew and Sarah. That really had gone nowhere. What they needed to do was also get DNA samples from all of their friends as well. It would take almost a month to collect all the DNA samples they requested, and then the detectives had to wait another 2 months just to get the results back, which arrived on March 30th. And when the results did arrive, Standifer just sat at his desk, staring at the results in shock. Because now he realized that a major piece of the puzzle had been right in front of him the entire time. Based on these DNA results, the investigation, and also a confession, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Rick and Susie Wamsley in the early morning hours of December 11th, 2003. Just before 3 a.m. on December 11th, the killer stood outside of 820 Turnberry Drive, watching Rick and Susie's garage door slowly rise. As they waited for it to open all the way, they felt both dread and also a sense of nervous anticipation. They had been talking about killing Susie and Rick for months, and actually, they had already tried to do it once before. But now, if everything went according to plan, it was actually going to happen. Once the door was fully open, the killer slipped inside, and as they entered, they could hear the sound of footsteps right behind them, their 2 accomplices. All 3 very quietly began to creep through the home, and as they passed through the kitchen, 2 of them grabbed knives. They already had a gun with them, but they figured it didn't hurt to be as prepared as possible. The house was completely silent. It was obvious both Rick and Susie were asleep. The killer was eager to get started, because in their mind, Rick and Susie had more money and a better life than they deserved, and it just was not fair. The killer had nothing, and so killing Rick and Susie would not only feel good, but it would be the answer to all of their problems. On the other side of what they did this night was going to be a much better life. And so with the gun in hand, the killer walked down the hallway to the living room where they found Susie, asleep on the couch under a blanket. And the killer, as soon as they were standing over her, raised their gun, aimed it at Susie's head, and fired a shot. And immediately, the killer then hurried upstairs to the bedroom where Rick was, and they shot at him too. Except this time, their aim was off. Their bullets hit the doorway outside the bedroom, and as Rick jolted up, the killer fired again. This shot hit Rick in the temple, but Rick didn't fall. Instead, to the killer's horror, he ran at the killer and began to fight them. The killer struggled with Rick, and before they knew it, they both were in the living room where Rick managed to force the killer to drop the gun. At this point, one of the 2 accomplices tried to get Rick off the killer, but while Rick was being pulled away, he managed to grab the killer's hair and ripped some of their hair out of their head, along with their hair clip. When Rick then tried to turn and run for the front door, the other accomplice grabbed the gun from the ground and shot Rick in the back, which caused him to finally collapse. But he still wasn't dead, and he looked up at the killer and the accomplices to ask why they were doing this. But the 3 of them just stared at Rick in shock. They hadn't realized how hard it was going to be to kill someone. And so now they were actually wondering if just shooting Susie once was actually enough to kill her. And so instead of talking to Rick, the killer and one of the accomplices began simultaneously stabbing Rick and Susie over and over again until they both were for sure dead. The trio then fled the home, and the primary killer spent the rest of the night totally excited about the good fortune that would almost certainly befall them once the bodies were discovered. But after that whole day passed, the next 20 or so hours passed, there still had been no indication that anybody knew Rick and Susie were dead. And this was a problem for the killer and their accomplices, because the sooner the bodies were found, the sooner they would get access to the money that they had killed for. So, just before midnight, they returned to the crime scene, picked up the landline phone, and dialed 911. Then, without saying anything, they placed the phone receiver on the counter and fled the house for a second time. When Detective Standifer got the DNA test results back from the hair that had been found at the crime scene, it told him exactly who had attacked Rick. But the hair didn't actually match any of his suspects. It belonged to someone that they actually hadn't even interviewed. The hair was a match for Susanna Toldano, the same Susanna who was a friend of Andrew's girlfriend, Chelsea, who was present at her house the day they went to go re-interview her. It would turn out Susanna was the one who had fired at Rick and Susie's car back in November. And on the night of the actual murders, it was Susanna who shot Susie and fought Rick. She was the primary killer. Susanna did this because she needed money, and she had actually been promised a large chunk of it by her accomplices, Andrew and Chelsea. It was Andrew and Chelsea's idea to murder Susie and Rick. Andrew was furious with his parents because they had cut him off financially after they found out he'd secretly dropped out of college. He was also in love with Chelsea, who didn't have a lot of money, and she lived with a single mother who had to work multiple jobs to barely keep their family afloat. And so the plan was made to murder the parents for money. But it was ultimately Susanna who pulled the trigger. Susanna, Chelsea, and Andrew were all convicted of murder, and they were all sentenced to life in prison. As for Sarah, she had nothing to do with the murders, and she has never healed from the loss of her parents. At around 8 p.m. on December 16, 2023, a 31-year-old man named Nestor Flores was driving down a highway just outside of Dallas, Texas, with both his hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. Nestor was very stressed out on this ride. All he wanted to do was get home because he was worried that on this ride, he might get pulled over by police. I mean, this was a route he had driven a bunch, and he knew there were loads of state troopers that patrolled the area. And from his perspective, it seemed like they kind of pulled people over all the time. And Nestor had spent the night out with a couple of friends, and he had had a couple of drinks. You know, he didn't feel he had had too much to where he couldn't drive, but he knew if he did get pulled over, he could be in trouble. And then on top of that, in the back of Nestor's mind was the fact that he had had a couple of minor run-ins with the law over the past couple of years. And so he kind of had this fear of police already. And also, Nestor was not born in America. And so he was worried that on top of all that, if he got pulled over, he could risk being deported. And so on whole, Nestor just does not want to see any police officer. He just wants to get home and go to bed. And so as Nestor is doing his best to not draw any suspicion to himself and is trying to follow all the rules of the road, he decides to have a sip of his Diet Coke. And his Diet Coke was right in the middle console, and so as he's driving eyes straight ahead, he reaches down and he grabs the Coke, he pulls it up, he uncaps it, takes a sip, but then as he puts the drink back down, again, he's keeping his eyes on the road, he hits something with the drink, and he feels the drink slosh out of his cup and it hits his hand, and instinctively, he took his eyes off the road and looked down at the Coke, and he managed to put the drink back in its cup holder, and then when he brought his eyes back to the road, there was a deer in the middle of the road. He was too close to swerve out of the way, and so at full speed, he smashes into this deer. The deer hits his front windshield and basically caves in the passenger side windshield and flips up and over the back of his car. And Nestor, amazingly, was composed enough to not swerve wildly post-impact, because he knew if he did that, he could run into oncoming traffic or something. And so he just kept on going straight and gradually slowed down and pulled off the side of the road. And as he did, he looked over his shoulder, seeing if this deer was basically lying in the road, or even worse, maybe it hit some other car. But when he looked over his shoulder, the road was clear. There was no deer. Now, even though Nestor was obviously very shaken up at this point, he just had this horrible car accident with this deer, and he's already on edge about getting pulled over by police. But for the moment, it was just peaceful on the highway. No cops were coming up to him, and he's pulled over to the side. Physically he was okay. It seemed like the deer was okay. It clearly ran off the road or something. And there was damage to his car. The deer really smashed in the front of his car, and the windshield, especially on the passenger side, was basically caved in. But Nestor was able to see through his side of the windshield, and when he put the car back in drive and hit the gas, the car seemed to drive just fine. And so even though Nestor felt kind of bad that he had smashed this deer, he thought, what am I going to do? Go find the deer and make sure it's okay? He can't really do anything. It's nighttime. So he made the decision that, nobody saw this and it seems like everything's okay. So I'm just going to drive home and I'll take care of my car tomorrow. But after driving 38 more miles from the impact site, Nestor's car began making this horrible rattling sound from the engine, and also smoke began to billow up out of the front of his car. And so Nestor knew, this is so conspicuous, he's gonna get pulled over if he doesn't stop. And so feeling really annoyed, because he was actually pretty close to home at this point, Nestor pulled off the highway and came to a stop in a parking lot of a fast food restaurant. And so at first, all Nestor did was just turn off his car and wait for a couple of minutes in hopes that, that would be enough to cure his car. But after a couple of minutes, the smoke continued to billow out of his car, and then when he tried to turn it back on again, the car simply wouldn't start. And so at this point, Nestor knew he had to call a tow truck. But when he reached for his phone was dead. And he didn't have a phone charger in his car, and so he's like, great, I can't even call a tow truck. But then he looked up and saw the fast food restaurant was open, and he decided he would just go in there, and he would ask one of them if they had a charger. So Nestor gets out of his smoking car, he walks into the restaurant, he goes up to the counter, and he asks the person behind the counter, like, hey, my phone's dead, do you have a charger? Do you mind charging my phone? But the employee, they didn't say anything back to Nestor. They just stood there with their mouths open and their eyes wide, staring at Nestor, like they couldn't believe what they were looking at. And so Nestor's thinking, like, what's wrong with this person? Hey, do you have a charger or not? And the employee, who by this point is pale as a ghost, just shook their head at Nestor, like, no, they don't have a charger. And then they just stood there, still staring at Nestor. And so now Nestor is genuinely just furious. The whole night has completely derailed here. All he wanted to do was get home, and it's like one horrible thing happens after another. And so Nestor was just like, okay, fine. And he turned around and he left the restaurant and went back to his car, thinking maybe if I search the whole vehicle, there's bound to be a charger in there somewhere. And so Nestor gets back into his car, he climbs into the driver's seat, he shuts the door, and as he begins looking around his car for this charger, he begins to feel really sleepy. And actually, he eventually just kind of leans forward and falls asleep in his car. More than 2 hours later, Nestor woke up to the sound of somebody tapping on his window. So Nestor groggily turned and looked, and it was like the worst case scenario. It was a police officer who was shining his flashlight into the vehicle, clearly gesturing for Nestor to roll his window down. And so Nestor was totally compliant, he rolled the window down, and he looked at the officer, and before Nestor could even say anything, the officer said, get out of the car. He's thinking to himself, why is he acting so aggressively towards me? Like, what have I done here? And so Nestor, he gets out of the car, and again, before Nestor can ask any questions, the officer just says to Nestor, what happened tonight? Like, what's going on here? And so Nestor, he knows his car is jacked up, and here he is sleeping in the parking lot, and so he turns to the officer and begins explaining the deer story. He was driving down the road, he hits this deer, it went over the top, he didn't see it, he didn't report it, and as he's telling the officer this, he's thinking, oh my gosh, like, is there a law? Like, if you hit a deer, are you supposed to report it? Is that what's going on? Maybe the deer did die, and it was in the middle of the road, and somebody saw his license plate, and now the cop was here. And so Nestor began to panic, trying to explain the logic behind leaving the deer, and how sorry he was, he should have stopped, he should have called the police, but the officer finally just put up his hand, telling Nestor to stop talking, and then the officer took his flashlight and he shined it past Nestor at his car. And when the officer did that, the officer immediately grabbed his radio and began barking orders into it, saying he needed backup. And so Nestor's like, what is going on here? Like, this whole night has been such a disaster. Like, what did I do? And so Nestor, he turned to see what the cop was looking at on his car that would elicit such a big response from him. And when he looked at the passenger seat of his car, where the cop's light was now shining, Nestor froze for a second and then just started to scream. It would turn out that even though Nestor believed he had only had, a few drinks and he was okay to drive, the reality was he was completely annihilated drunk and should never have been behind the wheel. And when he was driving on the highway, anxiously trying to get home, well, he didn't hit a deer. He hit a 45-year-old pedestrian named Terry Ivory, and he hit this guy with so much force that Terry went through the windshield on the passenger side and then landed in the passenger seat, minus one leg, which had been severed on impact. And then Terry's dead body sat there in the passenger seat with Nestor having no idea. He thinks there's a deer back there, but there was never a deer. There's just a dead guy next to him. And Nestor just drove 40 more miles with Terry's dead body next to him. And then when Nestor's car began to smoke and make noises, he pulled off the highway to that fast food restaurant parking lot. And then when he went inside the restaurant to try to get a phone charger, the reason that employee was so shocked to see Nestor and could basically not even speak when Nestor was trying to talk to them was because Nestor was covered practically head to toe in blood, Terry's blood. Now, it's not entirely clear why that employee did not immediately call police, But, after Nestor left the restaurant, went back to his car, and fell asleep, during the time Nestor was sleeping, someone inside the restaurant did call the police, and that's why they showed up and knocked on Nestor's glass. Nestor was charged with collision involving death in December of 2023. However, his case has not yet been adjudicated. Our next story is called Ancient Beast. On August 25th, 2010, a small twin-engine propeller plane sat on the tarmac at Kinshasa International Airport in the Congo. As the plane was being refueled, the co-pilots, 62-year-old Danny Philemont from Belgium and 39-year-old Chris Wilson from England, walked up the stairs and into the cockpit. As the pilots got settled in and began their internal systems checks, the flight attendant walked up the stairs, she said hello to the pilots, and then she began preparing the cabin for the passengers. The main cabin began boarding at 11 a.m., and by 11:30 a.m., all 18 passengers that were expected to board had taken their seats. So the flight attendant closed the doors, went into the cockpit, and told the pilots they were ready for takeoff. This was going to be a 1-hour-long routine domestic flight to Bandundu, which is a province that was just outside the border of Kinshasa to the east. This particular crew had made this flight dozens of times in the past without any issues. As the little plane made its way over to the runway, the flight attendant demonstrated what to do in case of various in-flight emergencies, and then by noon, the plane was airborne. 1 hour later, residents of a town located just southwest of Bandundu remembered looking up into the sky and seeing the small prop plane falling through the clouds in a near-vertical nosedive. Seconds later, the plane crashed into the ground right in the middle of the neighborhood. Luckily, the crash did not kill anybody on the ground, but unfortunately, the pilots, the flight attendant, and 17 of the 18 passengers died on impact. And the one passenger that survived was very badly hurt and was left in a coma. An investigation was launched into what happened, and very quickly it was theorized that they must have run out of gas, because when they hit the ground there was no explosion, there was no fire, but upon closer inspection it would turn out the plane had plenty of fuel. The black box, which is a device that records the audio inside the cockpit, was recovered, but unfortunately it was inoperable, so it didn't give them any other clues as to what happened. Investigators were stumped. Did they strike a bird in the air? Did the engines suddenly fail? Was it operator error? They didn't know. A few days after the crash, the one surviving passenger miraculously came out of their coma and remembered in vivid detail what happened up in the skies right before they crashed. They said as the plane was making their final descent into Bandundu, the flight attendant was walking down the aisle reminding everyone to put away their big devices and put their seat in the upright position, and as she got about halfway down the aisle, she looked towards the back of the plane and she suddenly gasped and covered her mouth, turned around and walked very quickly back towards the front of the plane into the cockpit where she disappeared. The passengers that had seen her do this were immediately concerned that something was wrong with the plane, and so they stood up and looked towards the rear of the plane where she had been looking, and right away they knew what it was she was concerned about. There was a hissing crocodile making its way up the aisle. Someone must have smuggled it on. And as passengers realized what was happening, they all panicked and stampeded towards the front of the plane. This sudden shift in weight threw off the plane's center of gravity, causing a nosedive that the pilots could not recover from before they crashed. After hearing this story, the investigators remembered that a living crocodile had been found around the wreckage, but no one had thought much of it because in the Congo, lots of exotic animals are smuggled onto flights. Specifically, crocodiles are smuggled onto these planes with such regularity that passengers often can recognize the very specific crocodile smell somewhere in the cabin. And they'll tell the pilots, he'll come back, they'll find the crocodile and the owner of said crocodile, they'll kick them off before takeoff. But obviously this time, nobody smelled the crocodile. The third and final story of today's episode is called Stay Forgetful. On the afternoon of July 13th, 1994, a man woke up feeling very confused and disoriented, and he felt some pain in the back of his head. And as he opened his eyes, he kind of slowly realized that he was on his back in a ditch on the side of the road, looking up at a big blue sky. The man tried to sit up, but as soon as he did, he felt this throbbing pain in the back of his head, and he reached back to touch it, but the second he did, it hurt even worse, and he definitely felt there was a pretty big lump on the back of his head. And then when he brought his hands in front of his face, he saw he had all these bruises around his wrists that he had no idea what they were from. And so as this man in the ditch is trying to figure out what's going on, suddenly this older man who he didn't know just appeared by the side of the road and looked down and said, "Hey, are you okay?" And so the guy in the ditch is looking at this guy. He's got no idea who he is. And he wants to say, what's going on? Where am I? Who am I? What's happening? But he couldn't find the words. It's like he just kept looking at this older guy, looking at his wrist and feeling his head and having no idea what's going on. But then for some reason, 3 names popped into this guy's head, the guy in the ditch. He thought of 3 names. He had no idea whose names these were, but for some reason, he felt like those names were really important. And so after a few minutes of awkward silence, as the guy in the ditch is trying to talk, he finally just blurts out these 3 names. He says, "Pat, Joel, Chris." And so the older man who had asked the guy in the ditch what was going on, he didn't really know how to react to this guy blurting out these names. And so he kind of ignored it and just said, "Okay, hi, my name's Steve." And then Steve, the older man, helped the guy from the ditch out of the ditch. And then once the man in the ditch was on his feet, kind of looking around, he looked at Steve and suddenly he could say other words. And he said to Steve, "Where are we?" And Steve looked at him and said, "We're in Cheyenne, Wyoming." Now, the guy in the ditch didn't know why, but he immediately felt like Wyoming had to be wrong. There's no way he could be in Wyoming. But the guy in the ditch didn't know where he was supposed to be. He didn't know who Steve was. He didn't know who Pat, Joel, or Chris was. And so it's all totally confusing. And so he just stood there kind of saying nothing. And as he did, Steve said, "Hold on a minute, I'm going to get my stuff." And so Steve kind of shuffled down the road 10, 20 feet away, where there was a shopping cart full of cans, and there was a backpack and some other things dangling off the side. And as Steve grabbed the shopping cart, turned it around, and slowly began pushing it back towards the guy in the ditch, the guy in the ditch stared at Steve and kind of put together that, Steve must be homeless. And this realization made the guy in the ditch think that, maybe he was homeless too. And so suddenly, instinctively, the guy from the ditch began reaching into his pockets, thinking maybe he had an ID or something that would show him who he was, that would show he was not homeless, that he had a place that he needed to go to. And he reached in his pockets, but there was nothing. All he found was 23 cents and a comb. And so by the time Steve came over with his cart and asked the guy from the ditch, "Hey, do you want to come to the shelter with me?" The guy from the ditch was like, "Okay, yeah, I'll go with you." And then once the guy from the ditch and Steve arrived at the shelter, when they went inside, the guy from the ditch had to introduce himself to the people who ran the shelter. And so he made up a name combining one of those names that was running through his head, Pat, with the color of the desk of the person who was asking him for his name inside of the shelter. And so he just called himself Pat Brown. And after Pat Brown got a room inside of the shelter, he went to bed that night, still having no idea what was going on, but he felt confident, if I just sleep tonight, I'll wake up tomorrow and I'll know what's going on. I'll figure out, what happened to me. But the next day when Pat woke up, he was still completely confused, did not know who he was, had no idea what was going on, but he had the wherewithal to know that, something bad must have happened to him. And maybe he should go talk to the police because maybe they would know if other people were looking for him or something. And so Pat walked from the shelter to the police station. It was not far away. And he went inside and very politely, he walked up to the desk. He introduced himself to the cop who was on duty. And Pat just began explaining to the cop as much as he could remember. He said, yesterday I woke up in a ditch. I don't know who I am. I don't know why I'm here. I think I have amnesia. I just keep thinking of 3 names in my head, Pat, Joel, and Chris, but I have no idea what they mean. Can you help me? Now, the cop who's hearing this did not think, "Oh my goodness, this is totally legitimate. Let's launch an investigation to figure out who you are." Instead, the cop is like, "Is this guy on drugs? Is he mentally ill? What's going on with this guy?" But the cop would say, Pat was incredibly polite and did not appear to be intoxicated. And so the cop humored him and said, "Okay, you know what? Let's look through the most recent missing person reports in the area to see if somebody matching your description, is a missing person." And so the cop began going through the database, but he couldn't find anybody that matched Pat's description. And so at some point he said, "Look, I can't really help you very much here because you're a grown man. You do not seem to be in distress here. And even though it's very unfortunate that you can't remember who you are or where you need to go or, where your family is, that's not really a police matter." But as he was saying this to Pat, who's kind of crestfallen, he's putting his hands near his face and just kind of reacting to this news that the police are not going to help him. And the police officer says, "Hold on a minute, look at your hand." And so Pat looked at his hand and he saw, there was no ring on his left ring finger, but there was a pretty obvious callus where a ring should have been. It looked like, Pat must have been wearing a ring up until recently, and for some reason it was now off. And so the cop said, "Hey, it looks like you may be married or were married for a long time because you got that callus. But, beyond that, I'm sorry, there's not much else I can offer you." And so even though this was somewhat valuable information, it didn't really point Pat in any direction. And so he was about to turn and leave when the cop said, "Hey, do you want to ride to the hospital? Because it seems like you could be having some sort of medical event here." But Pat politely declined and just told the officer to please be in touch with him if anybody came calling looking for somebody that kind of seemed like him. And the police officer said he would. And so after this, Pat left the station and went back to the shelter and basically told himself, "I'm going to stay here and just wait until my memory comes back." Because at this point, that was kind of all he could do. However, weeks would go by at the shelter and nobody would contact the police looking for somebody like Pat Brown, and Pat wouldn't remember any more details. The only thing that kept coming into his head was those three names, Pat, Joel, and Chris, but that was it. And so finally, after a few weeks of no progress being made, Pat decided he would leave the shelter in Cheyenne and go to Jackson, Wyoming, because some other people in the shelter had talked about Jackson, Wyoming as being a place where people who don't have ID cards could get jobs and basically start over. And because Jackson was only a little over 400 miles away from Cheyenne, it was not unreasonable to try to hitchhike your way to Jackson. And so almost exactly 2 months from the day Pat woke up inside of this ditch, he began hitchhiking his way towards Jackson. When Pat got to Jackson, he was able to get a job without an ID. He got a job at a newspaper sorting mail and doing some clerical work. And at first, he stayed in a shelter like he had in Cheyenne until he had saved up enough money to rent a room. And as the months went by in Jackson, Pat did begin to remember additional details about what seemed like his former life. He discovered while doing clerical work at the newspaper that he was able to use an adding machine without looking at it. It was like his fingers just knew where to go. He also discovered that he was able to do really complex math problems in his head. And then also, in virtue of being at the newspaper, he saw a lot of information about the stock market, and he actually seemed to know a lot about the stock market, even though he didn't know why. Also, while Pat was in Jackson, he started to feel this really intense compulsion to go to a Catholic church. And so he began going to Catholic Mass, and while he was in church, he just automatically began saying the prayers along with everybody else, even though, again, he didn't really know why he had that information in his head. But the biggest clue that came back to Pat while he was in Jackson was this recurring dream he would have where he was at this campground somewhere and this little boy comes around the corner and looks up at Pat and says, "Hey Dad, Mom needs your help with Chris." And then in the dream, he responds to this child by saying, "Okay, Joel, I'll be right there." And so with all these clues kind of coming back into focus, Pat sort of felt like he had a grip on who he used to be. Based on the callus on his finger and on that recurring dream, it did seem like he was a married man who had at least 2 kids, Joel and Chris, and so his wife was very likely named Pat, or maybe Pat was another child he didn't know. And then also he felt like he must have been maybe an accountant or somebody who worked with numbers, based on the adding machine and understanding the stock market and complex math problems. And also he was a devout Catholic, because that's the only way he would know all those prayers. But despite kind of putting together who he seemed to be in his previous life, that didn't really tell him anything about what he should do now. Like, he didn't know where his potential family was, or where his job was, or where he should go. And so even though he had this kind of former life formed in his mind, he couldn't act on it. And so Pat's weird life in limbo in Jackson, Wyoming just kind of continued to drag on. And so by the end of 1997, so by this point, it's been 3.5 years since Pat has woken up in the ditch confused. He's still in Jackson, Wyoming. He still has no idea who he is. And it's starting to set in that unless he takes drastic measures here, he'll never figure out the truth about who he is. And so early in 1998, Pat does take drastic measure. He contacts a very popular TV show at the time called Unsolved Mysteries and asks them to please cover his story, because if they did, it would be broadcast across the country and maybe somebody out there would recognize him and come find him. And sure enough, when Pat contacted Unsolved Mysteries, they thought his story was totally insane and they covered it. Pat's episode aired on April 10th, 1998, almost exactly 4 years after Pat woke up in that ditch. And on the day his episode aired, in a city in Indiana, 1,500 miles away from Jackson, Wyoming, a phone rang in a woman's house. And so she answered it, and it was her cousin, and her cousin told her, "Stop whatever you're doing and turn on the TV, put it on channel CBS." And so this woman, she walks into the living room, she turns on the TV, flips it to CBS, and she sees an episode of Unsolved Mysteries is playing, and it's Pat Brown's episode. And this woman is staring at the TV, and she practically faints when she sees what it's about. But she stays composed and just stands there staring at the TV, so shocked she can't even say anything. And the whole time her cousin is yelling through the phone, saying, "Can you believe it? Oh my goodness." And then at some point on the TV, a phone number flashed at the bottom of the screen where the producers of the show told the audience, "Hey, if you know anything about this case, call this number." And so with this, the woman who's watching the TV, she hangs up on her cousin and she dials that number she sees on the TV. Pat's drastic decision to call Unsolved Mysteries would indeed solve the mystery of who he was. However, the truth about who Pat was is not what you think. It would turn out some of the clues that Pat had sort of naturally recalled in those 4 years that he was kind of figuring out who he was were indeed clues of his former life. He really was a married father. Those 3 names, Pat, Joel, and Chris, those were the names of his wife and his 2 sons. Pat was his wife, and Joel and Chris were his 2 sons. And he really was a devout Catholic, which is why he was able to remember all of those prayers. But some of the other clues he thought of over those 4 years, like his incredible aptitude for math, or the fact that he could use an adding machine without looking, or the fact that he understood the stock market so easily, those were clues about his former life, but specifically, they were clues about why Pat was in this position in the first place. It would turn out Pat Brown was actually a man named Carl Brodnick Jr. And Carl Brodnick Jr. was a wanted felon who had misappropriated tens of thousands of dollars from the advertising agency where he worked as an accountant. And Carl had been under serious criminal investigation when he suddenly disappeared from his home in Indiana on July 8th, 1994, which is 5 days before Pat Brown woke up in that ditch on the side of the road with a lump on his head, markings on his wrist, and having no idea who he was or what happened to him. Now, there has never been a perfect explanation for what actually happened to Carl, but if you think about this logically, his claim of having amnesia is very likely true. Why would a guy use amnesia as his cover story to flee the law, run to Cheyenne, Wyoming and say, "I don't know who I am, I don't know what happened to me," only to then a few years later, go on national TV and out himself and totally make himself a target for the police? It doesn't make any sense. And then also adding credibility to this idea that maybe something happened to Carl versus Carl running off to save himself is we know that when Carl disappeared on July 8th, 1994 from his home in Indiana, he took out $1,000 in cash from his checking account and then also took out another large sum of cash from his home's second mortgage. However, when he woke up in that ditch, all the money was gone. He just had 23 cents in his pocket. Now, after Carl vanished from his house in Indiana, police did go looking for him because he was under criminal investigation, so they wanted to find him, and they pretty quickly found his car 250 miles away from his home in a strip mall parking lot in Missouri, but there was no sign of Carl anywhere. And then right after the police found his car, they checked Carl's credit card, and they discovered it had just been used in Colorado, so 900 miles away, to buy clothes. But when they went to that store and tried to find security footage of, when that transaction took place, there was no footage. And so there was no way of knowing if Carl really was the guy in Colorado making that transaction or if somebody else had his credit card. And then after that, there were no other leads. Nobody had any idea what happened to Carl. His family didn't know, the police had nothing to go on, and so very quickly his case went cold. Until 4 years later, when that episode of Unsolved Mysteries aired. Now, there are many theories about what could have happened to Carl, but the leading theory, that again is just a theory, is that Carl may have been in debt to some very dangerous people. And so when he fled his home in Indiana, it's very likely that he was not running from the law, even though he was under criminal investigation. He was actually running from these dangerous people.
and that the reason he might have been stealing from his company was to pay off these dangerous people, but apparently it wasn't enough, hence why he decided to just kind of take off and run away. And these dangerous people seemed to have caught up to him, and they captured him, and it looked like they tied his wrists at some point because of the marks on his wrist, and they very likely tortured him or something, hence why he had this very serious head injury, and then it seems like they dumped him on the side of the road, very likely to die. They might have thought he was dead already, but he didn't die, and when he came to, he must have really had amnesia from the injuries he sustained from these bad people that chased him down. But again, that's just a theory. When Carl's episode of Unsolved Mysteries aired, it was his wife, Pat Brodnick, who was the one who saw him on TV and couldn't believe it and called it in. And then when she called this in, at first, Pat was reunited with his family, and it was this big happy reunion. Pat comes back home, he sees his wife and his kids, and then he's immediately arrested and prosecuted for embezzlement. Now, ultimately, Carl would plead guilty to the charges against him, but he would say the whole time, I don't remember committing this crime. I don't remember anything. And so ultimately, Carl did not get sent to prison. He instead served time on probation, and then after it was over, he just went back to living as Carl Brodnick Jr., despite still having huge gaps in his memory, at least according to Carl.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen's podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's